Hey, welcome everyone. We're Chris Meyer with IntelliCheck and Alexander Hall. We're ready to roll into episode 3 of our Freedom from Fraud series. So, very excited today to really get into the meats and potatoes of really what we've been discussing the last few episodes. Just to rewind, we've really gone back and spent some time talking about what's facing the landscape, why there's so many instances of data theft, identity impersonation. It's really about all the massive data breaches, the mail theft that continues to happen on a daily basis, and then what are the criminals using that information for. So today, what and Alex and I have been talking, what we really thought we'd do is spend some time unpacking and going, okay, what can be done about this, and what are some of the effective strategies to really help offset the damage that these criminals are doing. So, Alex, before we get started, just hey, welcome. Thanks for again, as always, for taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks for having me back for round 3. We're covering some good stuff.
Awesome. Well, hey, let's just get into it. So, really, let's start with the importance of that authoritative data. That's one of the things that we alluded to last time. You had mentioned some things about that, but really I think it's critical for everyone to understand, what is the importance of understanding the difference between the authoritative data that you referred to previously versus the traditional KYC data that is usually used inside current fraud prevention strategies.
Sure. So there's a big umbrella, right, of authoritative data, and it can be represented in several different ways. But what it really boils down to is the difference between implied accurate information and factually accurate information, right? So the quickest example that I think everyone can get behind is the idea of like a CVV, right? When somebody does a transaction analysis and they identify whether or not the CVV is accurate, right? So that would be the first fundamental idea of what authoritative is. It's definitively what the institution has on file for that card. Now, when we move over to like something like a shipping address, it might be implied accurate whenever a transaction went through 3 months ago or whatever period of time ago that didn't receive a chargeback or wasn't viewed as suspicious. We imply that it's reliable. We imply that it's good, and that has its place in the light. No one's going to take away the value of the implied accuracy, but when we're dealing with authoritative data sets that we know what it is, it's black and white, it's period, right? That's whenever we can start making more accurate determinations more reliably.
Gotcha. No. And so following and really understanding the differences, authoritative data also is it more of a challenge for criminals to get their hands on that versus the traditional KYC data sets that are being breached every single day?
So there's another split there. For example, the CVV with traditional payment fraud is going to be available in many of these data breaches. However, when we shift that lens away from information that can be copied and pasted or obtained, we start to see things emerge that are a little bit more passive. Things like behaviors and things like device intelligence and some forms of biometrics and things like that. And the reason why I feel that is important is when an organization starts to build out their strategy, the execution and weighing of different data sets is going to be a huge dynamic in their success. And yeah, so when we're talking about breached data and what a fraudster can get a hold of, the truth of the matter is anything that can be typed into a form can and is obtained by fraudsters across the board, whether it's payment information or identity information. If fraudsters can type it into a form, if your customer can type it into a form through a request, so too can a fraudster. And then the question becomes, is this definitively accurate or is this implied to be accurate? And that's the big consideration there.
So what are some of the different ways to confirm that the data is accurate? What are some examples that you feel are out there of authoritative data that can be confirmed that is not easily able to be confirmed? And again, we're talking about authoritative data, but what are some examples of what that looks like?
Sure. So I think that the first example is the CVV, like I said, but that's pretty low level, and it can be obtained, copied, and pasted. Okay, so that's like the first example. Is it right? Is it wrong? Cool. But then we move forward, and there's a lot of misnomers regarding what is considered to be accurate from the source. And so what we've seen adopted across the board will be like things like identity, ID card, OCR, and the models that are centered around abstracting that information. And unfortunately, what that does is it kind of muddles the idea of accuracy from the data source. So when we think about the issuing institution issuing out the CVV, we are equally talking about the DMVs issuing this information. And what I've seen take place with particular IDV technologies is they're reading the information on the card and then they're funneling it through implied accurate data sets and data sources. So they'll take the name and the address, they'll take the information, they'll extract it using OCR or whatever recognition system they have over there, but then they're funneling it through the same exact PII, KYC, aggregated data sets that
Right.
and it's implied accurate, but it isn't authoritative. It doesn't go back to the source and all of that. And the fear there is that fake IDs are being made with accurate information and passing the IDV verification checks, right? So yeah, I would definitely say that where authoritative information comes from is going to be things like the issuing institution trying to figure out a way to make sure that what is issued on what is printed on a card is what the DMV has on file, which I'll tell you is one thing that I really appreciate about IntelliCheck, but I think we'll get into that in a little bit. The fact that these security features are hidden under multiple layers. I love that. It's not something that can be easily extracted from a stolen ID and then reprinted on another one that then satisfies OCR models. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, and that is one of the things in the conversations we have with new prospects and new customers is really getting them to understand, hey, there's data that can be printed on anything. And as long as that data matches what's on that DMV record, it is assumed that means it's valid. But as we've talked about with all the data breaches and all the information that's available, you can't trust that. But what you can, if you have, the right systems in place, and that's one of the things we like to, our unique differentiators, being able to confirm those hidden security features that are not public knowledge, that not anyone else has access to. And it's really because of our longstanding history we've had with those issuing jurisdictions and the associations for so many years. So, but that's a critical piece beyond some of the other things, even of just making sure, how do you get back to the source of truth of that issuing, whoever that issuer was, of confirming what is not visible, but is still present in that documentation. I think that's more of a key, and that's where we've helped our clients as well. So, what are some of the challenges you see in why others are not adopting this approach? Because again, most of the processes in place right now is really about verifying data, not that authoritative data, or even some of these other things that are available out there now. What do you see is really what? Why is that hesitance to do so, or what's the issue with doing so?
So I think it's three part, and it boils down to three different pieces. One is IDV, the idea of IDV in these models that exist today. There are many vendors out there that claim to be effective in that realm. But as I just mentioned, those same OCR technology, the optical character recognition technology, is just taking what's printed on that card and running it through the PII data set that is otherwise available. And what that does is it paints a particular picture of overall IDV that makes it seem like that's the extent of relevance. It's the extent of accuracy that they can obtain. So I think that would be one. Two would be for it to be relevant in an effective fraud prevention strategy, that rollout is really encumbersome, and it's a big deal, and it takes a lot of manpower. At least that's the thought behind it. And then three would be the idea of friction being brought into the equation. It wouldn't be something, especially when we're dealing, for example, with the authoritative data provided by the DMVs. It would be an additional unconventional form of friction that maybe users, I will say that maybe merchants aren't confident in. I think those are the three biggest obstacles when it comes, or that lead to the hesitancy of adoption. But of course, everything can be overcome.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that, is really, as you and I've discussed, is having the right structure of what that all those different tools and implementing, not only just it starts with making sure that the ID is in fact genuine, and it goes back to that authoritative data and set of models and OCR and those kind of things. But then beyond that is, now that we know the ID is real, what else can we find out about that person? How do we know it belongs to that person? That's where facial biometrics comes into play, when they're not standing there in front of you. But then what other signals, what other caution, what other areas can we let you know is, hey, now should you trust doing business with this person? Which really leads me into, beyond that authoritative data, outside of that, what other data sets are you do you see and that you find? I mean, again, let's set this with the preface of, you were an ex fraudster, and so you stay heavily engaged with this and understanding, hey, what is available, what worked and what doesn't work. What is it that you're seeing today that's really almost nearly impossible for fraudsters to acquire and mimic when it comes to outside of that authoritative data that we talked about?
Sure. So for the past 7 years since I gave up that lifestyle, I've been asking myself that question. Every time that I hear about a new vendor, a new data set, a new technology, with the emergence of what we label as AI and ML, I'm constantly asking myself that question of, when I was at the peak of my operation, what would stop me? And then also when I'm evaluating new vendors, um, how well would I perform against them? And then because now that I'm on the other side, I get access to the back end, and I say, oh well, had I learned about that? So I've done a lot of thinking about that question specifically, and everything seems to boil down to one, the use of authoritative data, but we've covered that. But then two is what I classify as passive data. And I think that uh, the reason why it's so powerful is that it's in contrast to information that can be submitted through a request or a form. And so let me draw out this picture. For the last 30 or so years, ever since digital security has been established, we started with a digital account, online being created, and a password, right? And that was the extent of it. So someone goes and they log in, username, password. Then we hop forward a little bit and we have email and phone number verifications. Well, they send out a verification link, the link gets clicked, and then that grows to OTPs, and then that grows to back-end verifications, and then that grows to knowledge-based verification questions based on credit, history and things like that. And it goes and goes and goes. And then, in the last five or so years, we started to see biometrics emerge. Now, the dynamic that's in play throughout all of it is, there is in fact the opportunity for the fraudster to get a hold of any one or any of those pieces of information and submit it through the form, call into customer service to bypass the online security measures, submit it to the customer service agent, and then have access to the accounts or do what they're trying to do. And I think that, so there's where we've been for the past 20, 30 years. Where I feel we need to go is into passive data verifications. And so there are different data sets that fall into that category. So we have, first and foremost, for what I feel would be most important and quickly to adopt, is behavioral analytics. When does this person interact with their platform? Where do they interact from? What device are they using? What time? How do they interact with the platform? What kind of requests are they making against the platform? Behavior is the all-encompassing data set, and it's comprised of things like geolocation, device intelligence, transactions on any platform. Now, transactions can be logging in, transactions can be establishing a new account, transactions can be peer-to-peer payments on and off, platform. Things like logging in and contacting customer service, everything is a transaction. And so if we track these behaviors from what are considered to be established and good standing accounts, we can then see what is determined as suspicious. Huge spiel, had to draw the contrast, but I feel that that's the most powerful way to offset a fraudster's operation, is to move out of requesting more information and into tracking passive behaviors over time.
No, that makes sense, and that's one of the things that we help our clients with as well is just those additional, you call them passive data, we call them the additional signals of just, hey, trust. How do we make sure now that we know the ID presented, it belongs to the person? Now it's, is there anything else suspicious? And I love the what you say about transactions because everything is a transaction. Every interaction is a transaction. And we used to think transactions were just about a monetary exchange. And now it's like, no, anytime we're exchanging in anything, communication, information, it's all a transaction. So, but that also goes to, their mobile device, the IP that they're coming from. How do you see using that passive the data though? What do you see as the biggest challenge of trying to implement that? Because I know others use, hey, we can track information about the device, we know the IP, but where do you think the stumbling block is really when it comes to implementing how you utilize that passive data? And then when you tie it on top of this behavioral, that you're talking about as well, as being able to tie it to their behavioral patterns as well. Where's the challenge maybe with that, tying it all together right now?
So if we look at an organization or a platform that has the passive data sets actively integrated throughout their system, what we're going to see is that there's a lot of data, right? It's a huge river of information coming at you, and there's just so much data that it can be overwhelming. And that's another point that I'll raise is the value in partnering with somebody who can distill that information down into something actionable. I think that the hesitancy or the challenge is that what do we do with all of the information, right? We go from
Right.
tracking at payment, we go at tracking at checkout, and we're tracking payment information and some PII, but now we have all of this information. What the heck do we do with it? It can be overwhelming when you're first introducing this idea to somebody, um, to move into 5 or 6 different data sets across 20 or 30 different touch points, whether you're in store, out of store, online, on a computer, on a phone, whatever it is. It can be an overwhelming thought. So that would be one, is the abundance of information that comes along with it and how to distill it down into something actionable. I would say number two is there's a bit of a learning curve, right? If somebody presents to you a billing address and a shipping address, and you have some form of implied information or authoritative information saying whether or not it's accurate, it's easy. I won't say it's easy, but it's quick to understand whether or not that shipping address has been seen before in relation to this name, this email, this phone number. It's an easy enough concept to understand. Um, in contrast, moving to all of this, there's a bit of a learning curve to understand what the difference in IP is, what the gyroscope might be doing on the device, where spending over time has occurred in store in LA versus an IP address in New York. It can be overwhelming just for the subject matter, right? It takes there's a learning curve to interact with it. And then three is it's novel. This is a novel idea. So again, to draw a contrast between all of the OCR, IDV verification platforms out there, where there's a million of them doing the same thing with implied accuracy and reliability. This one is relatively new. You have a lot of data providers with geolocation and device intelligence, but you don't see many of them approaching the entirety of the platform, tracking the behaviors across the entire account performance. And I think that might put some thoughts into certain people's minds regarding just how novel it is. It's a new idea. Let's see how it can perform. Yeah, so that's what I think would be the biggest challenges.
No, that makes sense. And I know for many of the conversations, it's with all the data breaches that take place, no one wants to be the next victim of a data breach. So I do think, there are ways of, first of all, it doesn't have to be, and that's really what we're talking about. I think that's the message everyone needs to understand is it doesn't need to be PII data, which then can be used against someone. So there are ways, though, of just how do you harness all of this? It's almost like the internet. How do you take all this information that's available and then you narrow it down and figure out how to use it to the most benefit? Um, we're helping clients walk through that right now. Part of it is a change of mindset and going, hey, what we've always thought was this, let's say the source of truth. Now that's been compromised. So now we have to look at some other means of feeling comfortable and confident that who we're dealing with, no matter where that transaction is taking place, is truly them, and we feel safe moving forward with it. Alex, you've mentioned many times that you know every request not only plays to the hands of the fraudsters, but it creates more friction. Um, and that's something that a lot of a lot of concern, especially in our space, is hey, we want to implement these things, but we're worried about the friction. Let's talk more about that. What do you mean with it when you've said that previously? Is like, hey, every time we do something, it plays into the hands of fraudsters, but it's added more friction. Let's dig into that a little bit more.
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack there, but continuing on with the example I gave earlier about the history of verifications and digital security, continuing on with that, what typically is the dynamic is we say, oh, well, we're getting hit with ATOs, so we'll put a rule in place. And every time that this rule is triggered, we'll go ahead and send out a request where somebody has to, I don't know, scan their ID or do an email verification or satisfy an OTP, whatever it is. When a fraudster is or I'll just speak from experience, when I was evaluating a platform, I would use pieces of information that were sacrificial. Let me pause. I wrote an article for Card Not Present, CNP, when I first joined fraud prevention, and it was outlining what I call the three pillars of a fraudster's operation. So we have payment information, identity information, and system knowledge. It's that system knowledge aspect that's overlooked often, right? And so I'll spend a second here to kind of articulate why we're playing to the hands of the fraudster. And it goes like this. When I was on the other side, I had no problem taking 10, 20, 100 different identity sets or payment information and experimenting with a platform in order to find out where the openings were. Now, I sacrificed 5, 10, 20 pieces of information, but I found out if I put in this order and then I call customer service and then I request a change over here, or I create an account or I check out as a guest, and I'm able to poke and prod and figure all of this out. Fraudsters, I'm sure, are doing the same thing today that I was a decade ago. If that's the case, they're going to find out what triggers the request. They're going to call into customer service and say, hey, I got this request. How do I satisfy it? They're going to, anything that can be entered into a form, spoken over the phone, is going to be there. And then consider also this emergence of scams and the general public exploits that are happening, where the actual user, the good user, is being coerced or forced or manipulated in order to satisfy the requirements. It's going to make it even harder. And so that's why one thing that I really drill down on is any request that we put out to a user, a fraudster can satisfy. And it's something that I feel that we should all like really drill in there. Get it in there.
There's a lot of conversations even right now taking place of who bears the responsibility, especially, with identity impersonation. And I know we hit on this last time, but identity impersonation is the fraud that's taking place that is almost running out of control. Because again, when someone has the ability to impersonate you and they have everything that is needed to carry that out, then it becomes very, very difficult to stop. Then when you add on top of that, criminals are actually scamming the actual victims into playing along into it. That's where it can get very, very challenging. And that's where these conversations are taking place. Like, who's responsible for, is it the victim or is it the institution? And at the same time, it's one of those things where everyone needs to have the safeguards in place, which is why we do, why we're doing this, is to educate and to say, hey, here's what's taking place out there. But let's get back to that piece about friction. So, okay, everything we're doing is playing into the hands, is giving them more information to test with. But where does the friction part come into play for you?
So that's it. Every time that we make a new request where a user has to go off platform and satisfy this, they have to go check their email or they have to submit a document or any one of these items. Every time they do that, we have to consider two items. How many of the people that we intend to catch are we catching? And how many good users are getting caught up in these rule-based verification added friction systems? And it's a big problem for a reason you and I have discussed many times. If we were to mitigate 100% of the fraud, that has a glass ceiling, right? detection of fraud, you can only stop as many attempts as what happened, as what occurs. Whereas the value of the value of insulting good users, the value of abandonments when they're trying to sign up for an account, but some rule is kicking up something suspicious and they have to jump through 2 or 3 different verifications or whatever it might be, that can cause an infinite amount of damage. And I know that that is a conscious, a big idea that's in play with a lot of these organizations. Is some of them are, they know that friction is hurting their business, and so the idea of doing something, like I said here, novel, or something that's less than definitively accurate with this authoritative data, seems risky. They don't want to run the risk of it. So anyway, friction has many different faces, whether it's confirmation emails going out that have been held up because of some verification on the back end, some timely process, or just additional steps in order to get checked out or log in. It can become a mess very quickly. And so there's those two dynamics to consider. Not only do additional requests play to the hands of the fraudster and benefit the fraudster when they're trying to attack our platforms, but it also causes a headache for our good users. In contrast to all of that, we move over into passive data sets. The good users don't have to do anything. Their behaviors, their devices, all of that is compiled to represent that this person is who they need to be, is who they claim to be, and should be allowed to do what they need to do. But we're mindful of that. They just live their life, and in so doing is verifying them. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
It's conversation we have daily is improving the customer experience while still mitigating fraud. So making life better for your good customers while making life miserable for the bad guys. Because at the end of the day, those are the ones who should have the miserable experience, not the customer, because you're putting them through a friction-filled process. So I love the way you said that. So got to ask you this. With what your background was, this is something that I've been thinking. I'm always trying to think it's a game of chess, not checkers, right? So what is it that you feel right now? I mean, one of the favorite questions I have when I'm on an intro call with someone is like, what's keeping you up at night? What are the challenges? What are the things that are keeping you up at night? And the list just goes on and on. It's about fraud. It's about conversion rates. It's about abandonment rates. It's, all the things we've been talking about and how to tie it all together. But what is it that you think right now, maybe that the fraudsters are staying up at night, because they really have it easy right now because of these ways of continuing to rely on the data that is readily available, and they can just buy it online. So they feel comfortable right now. But what is it you think that is keeping them up at night that they're hoping we don't make that shift to?
I know that the biggest headache for me, and I think I've said this on several podcasts, the biggest headache for me was not knowing why something failed. Right. And so I've given this story of there was this big box store in Las Vegas. I had to hit them on the website. I had hit them over the phone. I'd done several of these different things, but I could never get a what we call BOPIS. At the time, it was like called authorized pickup or something like that. But I could never get a BOPIS order to go all the way through with a secondary pickup person, and they never told me why. And so what I hope to extrapolate from that for the viewers today is the more accurate your determinations are, and then through that, the less information you give to the fraudsters, means that they get less understanding of what that system knowledge pillar is that I mentioned earlier. They don't know what they did wrong. They don't know what they need to fix. They don't know what went wrong in the process. Now, it's not something you can just slap on today, because think about how many good users are going to get caught up in that, But I feel that if I had encountered a seamless checkout process and then didn't know why it failed, called into customer service, hey, why was this, and all this different stuff, and it was because of something that I couldn't replicate, like the behavioral analytics, the behavioral performance, I should say, the matching device, the geolocation, the time, the way that I interacted with the platform. If I couldn't reverse engineer why it failed, I wouldn't be able to produce what the system needed. And I think that um, to answer your question directly, the thing that fraudsters generally hate to encounter is no information on why it failed. They hate to encounter something they can't reverse engineer. And then if we bring that up to put it in an actionable way, passive back end verifications that are even stacked on top of each other are going to be not only impossible to reverse engineer, but very difficult. And it would just destroy a fraudster's success rate. Imagine the effort that it would take on a credit card to go track everything that this person does on that platform and then finally be able to execute. Like, the time it would take would just be insane. So not only do we stack the cards against the fraudsters by moving into passive, but they don't have insight that says, oh, well, maybe I just need to type in this information instead or use this type of data instead. I think that's the perfect storm against them.
No, that's great information. And again, I think it's important, hopefully the takeaway from this for everyone who's watching today is we've got to think outside the box. We've got to quit utilizing the same information that the fraudsters are utilizing, because that's how they're beating, so many of the businesses and organizations out there. Is they're really hoping nothing changes. And I think this conversation today is not only what needs to change, but really how to go and start implementing that, because it doesn't have to be a complicated process. You can start implementing some of these passive data sets. I mean, and even on the very front end, and there's my, for what we do, just even on that very first, let's get better at making sure, without the friction, that is a genuine document versus just it appears to be genuine, and then it opens up the floodgates for so much damage. So, well, Alex, I love our time. Always do. One of the things I'd love to say for everyone who's watching is I've been, as we've launched this the last couple episodes, I've received messages on LinkedIn and some emails. Hey, how do we do this? How does that? That's what's even driving some of this conversation Alex and I are having right now. So I'd love to say, please send those questions. Obviously, easy to find on LinkedIn, find the email, but we want to continue to not only help educate, but answer the questions that so many are struggling with right now. Because again, I've said this once, I'll continue to say it. The fraudsters are organized. It's time that all of us, when preventing fraud, are more organized in our efforts as well. That means sharing information. It's going to mean coming together and exploring what new things out there can be done together, but also how to utilize this data more in a genuine effort together. So anyway, very much appreciate the time, Alex. Love the time with you. Everyone else, thank you so much. Looking forward to our next episode where we'll dig in just a little bit further and get more specific. So have a great day. Thanks, everyone.